407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here.
Abraham Lincoln, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, November 19th, 1863. Hello, I'm Jess Peterson with Amazing Stories, and today we're going to talk about Memorial Day. So what is Memorial Day? Memorial Day was originally known as Decoration Day. It is a federal holiday in the United States honoring and mourning the military personnel that died while serving in the United States Armed Forces. Celebrated the last Monday of May and considered actually the unofficial start of summer as well. So what's the difference between Memorial Day and Veterans Day and Armed Forces Day? Well, Memorial Day celebrates or remembers, mourns for those who lost their life in battle, those who lost their life in the armed forces. Veterans Day, which is celebrated in November, it used to be called Armistice Day originally. And the reason it was called Armistice Day is because it was on the anniversary of the armistice from World War I, which was the 11th hour of the 11th month of the 11th day of 1918. Veterans Day celebrates all veterans. And then there's Armed Forces Day. Armed Forces Day is held the third Saturday in May, and it is to celebrate those who are currently serving in the military. So those who died in the military, all those who have served in the military, those who currently served in the military. So where did Memorial Day start? Well, according to the Veterans Affairs Department, there are about 25 different places that have claimed as to be the beginning, their origin of Memorial Day. And so we won't hit all 25, but we'll hit a few of those. And we'll start in those in the South. And really the precedent for Memorial Day began in the South and during the Civil War time. Now, why the South? Well, the South is where the most battlefields are, so it would have been where the most dead were. So the first president was in Warrentown, Virginia, June 3rd, 1861. This was the date that the Confederate captain, Virginia Military Company Captain John Quincy Marr, his funeral was. He had actually been killed 2 days earlier during a skirmish at the Battle of Fairfax Courthouse. He's considered the first Confederate soldier killed by a Union soldier during the Civil War. Mr. Marr was 36 years old. He had actually served as a representative to the Virginia Secession Convention of 1861 and had been originally against the secession of Virginia from the Union, but he ultimately supported it. Virginia seceded in April 1861. Captain Marr died less than 2 months later. Another spot is Savannah, Georgia, July of 1862. In that month, the women that decorated the graves of Colonel Francis S. Barstow and his comrades, who had died in the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as the Battle of Manassas. And that was a year before, so they came upon his anniversary. Barstow is considered the first Confederate officer of the official army of the Confederacy to die in the Civil War. And then there's Jackson, Mississippi. This is Sarah Landon Vaughn. She was an American artist and writer, and she claims to have originated Memorial Day. Actually, her name and her date appear on the Confederate monument in Jackson, Mississippi. The story goes that she was at a friend's home north of Jackson on the night of April 25, 1865. Around midnight, 2 couriers arrived to tell them that their army was on the verge of surrender. She grabs a pencil and scrap of paper to write a plea to the daughters of the Southland to garland the graves of the dead soldiers the next day. The note is pinned to the jacket of one of the couriers, who rushes to the newspaper office to have it printed in the next day's paper. The following morning, everyone meets at the cemeteries and the graves are heaped with flowers, starting the Memorial Day holiday. Now, the problem is this, is she wrote several different versions of the story, and this story has since then proved to be a myth. But a truer story was from Charleston, South Carolina. May 1st, 1865, free African Americans held a parade of about 10,000 people to honor 257 dead Union soldiers. Now, these freed slaves had reburied the remains of these soldiers from a mass grave from a Confederate prison camp. Historian David Bly claimed that African Americans invented Memorial Day, but in reality there's no evidence that the event inspired the establishment of Memorial Day. But a more solid basis comes from Columbus, Georgia, March 1866. The Ladies' Memorial Association, led by their secretary, Mary Ann Williams, pictured here, wrote a letter to the press asking assistance in establishing an annual holiday to decorate the graves of soldiers throughout the South. The letters were reprinted in several southern states, and they were noted in the newspapers in the North. They chose April 26th, and the holiday was reserved in several cities throughout Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Cities in Virginia and elsewhere chose other dates in May and June. But this was certainly a more established, more widespread thing. Well, that was Columbus, Georgia. Then there was Columbus, Mississippi. A month later, April 1866, 4 women, pictured here, gathered to decorate the graves of Confederate soldiers, and then they decided to honor the Union soldiers as well and decorate their graves. And so some writers say that this gesture of humanity and reconciliation was the inspiration of the original Memorial Day, despite the fact that of most of the 25, this is the latest date that something happened. Now, not only were there things going on in the South, but there were precedents in the North also, not as much as in the South, because, like I say, the battlefields were in the South. Note Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, November 19th, 1863. Of course, that dedication came together that day. That is the day of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and it was a ceremony of commemoration of the graves of the dead soldiers. And you can see in the picture, the arrow is pointing to Lincoln sitting there, and that is the only picture of President Lincoln at the Gettysburg ceremony. His address was so short that the cameraman did not get a chance to shoot a picture of him while he was speaking. Interesting story, the Gettysburg Address, and I've done a whole story on that, and maybe I'll share that with you again sometime. So Gettysburg became a national cemetery. Some say that Abraham Lincoln was the one who started the Memorial Day holiday, was the vision for the Memorial Day holiday. Others say it was actually Lincoln's funeral that fanned the flames and spurred the decoration day that started. Today, by the way, there are 142 national cemeteries in 42 states. So there are some that do not have a national cemetery. There are also state veterans cemeteries as well. In Texas, there are 6 national cemeteries and 4 state cemeteries. The largest of those is one of the newest ones. It's in Dallas. It was actually opened in the year 2000. It's the 9th largest national cemetery in the country. It's 638 acres. Now, when we think of National Cemetery, we think of Gettysburg and we think of Arlington. But neither one of those were among the first ones. and neither one of those are among the 10 largest. Gettysburg is actually only 17 acres. And Arlington National Cemetery is one of the larger ones, but it still is smaller than the one in Dallas. It's 624 acres. So there in the north, at least, there's Gettysburg. And then there was Boalsburg, Pennsylvania, October 1864. So in October 1864, according to the Boalsburg Heritage Museum, two teenage girls named Emma Hunter and Sophie Keller gathered garden flowers to place on the grave of Emma's father, Dr. Reuben Hunter. He had been a Union Army surgeon and died on September 19, 1864 in Annapolis, Maryland. On the same day, an older woman was scattering flowers on the grave of her son, Amos Meyer, who had been a private at the Battle of Gettysburg. So after the decorating of the graves of the recently fallen Boalsburg soldiers, they also decorated the graves of those men who had died in the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War. The women decided to meet again the following year to honor their loved ones and other fallen soldiers, and they shared their plans. And on July 4th, 1865, all of Boalsburg gathered with a clergyman for a sermon and decoration of graves. The event became an annual Decoration Day tradition. And then there was Waterloo, New York, May 5th, 1866. The town claimed it was the first celebrated Memorial Day on that day. It was the first Memorial Day at which businesses were closed, where flags flew half-staff, where residents decorated graves. They came together as a town, as a village. It was spurred by druggist Henry C. Wells and County Clerk John B. Murray as starters of that day. Waterloo, like I said, it was the first formal, village-wise annual observance of a day dedicated to honoring the dead. Scholars have questioned the date. There was a news article in the paper in Waterloo from 1883 that referred back to the beginnings of it. And it was that article that put the year 1866 on it. And then it later retracted that article and put 1868 on it. But the papers that picked up that article, otherwise they didn't pick up the correction, and so 1866 has been given as the date. Waterloo has a National Memorial Day Museum. You can see the picture there. May 26, 1966, a year later after the supposed starting date in Waterloo, President Lyndon Johnson designated Waterloo as the official birthplace of Memorial Day. This was following a resolution by Congress. But how did all these local gatherings get to be such a national event? Well, we'll explore that in a minute, but first, let's take a field trip. I'm out here today with my teenage grandkids at City of Lubbock Cemetery, and we're going to find out today what we can find out about veterans. City of Lubbock Cemetery is the oldest and largest in Lubbock, so come join us. So Lubbock Cemetery is the largest cemetery in Lubbock, and it's one of the largest in the state. It's actually the third largest private cemetery in the state. So back in 1892, some residents of Lubbock approached rancher H.M. Bandy, asking for some land to be used for a cemetery for Lubbock. Mr. Bandy donated these 5 acres. The first burial was actually done by a Cochran County cowboy by the name of Henry Jenkins. And then the first resident that was buried in the Lubbock Cemetery was Mr. Joseph R. Coleman, who died also in 1892. In the Lubbock cemeteries, there's about 60,000 graves. There's about 2,000 veterans buried here. The cemetery was divided in the past into different sections, about 4 sections, and that depended upon what your economic status was, what your racial status was, etc. And they were all, the cemetery was kept together by different associations, and even had an association for migrant workers. Let's go see what we can find. This is the grave of Henry Jenkins. Henry Jenkins was a cowboy, age about 32 years old, died on March 10th, 1892. He was the first person buried in the cemetery. We don't know much about him other than he developed pneumonia while staying in one of the hotels, I guess you'd call it, here in Lubbock. Of course, pneumonia at that time was the #1 killer of everyone in the United States and actually through the world. This marker was put up later. There was no marker at the time Henry Jenkins died. Actually, the first marker that was put in the cemetery was of a Lubbock resident, and that marker is no longer here. So, hats off, cowboy. Of course, you can't come to City of Lubbock Cemetery without stopping by the Buddy Holly grave site. Lubbock's favorite son. You notice it's Holley, not Hollly. His name got changed when he became famous, and you can see what people have dropped off here in memory of him. You've got guitar picks. You've even got a coronavirus mask here and pennies for good luck. This is a marker set up by the Confederate States of America, Texas Division. It was set up by the Sons of Confederate Veterans and by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. United Daughters of the Confederacy was one of the largest associations of this kind across the country. At one time, by World War I, they had over 100,000 members, and they were very useful in setting up memorials all across, especially the South, for Civil War veterans. And so a lot of these statues and memorials that are so controversial today, they were set up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. This particular memorial is in memory of those who served during the Civil War. And you notice it's not just the Confederacy, because some of them are marked USA. So some of these would be Texans that have served not only on the South Side, but also on the Union side as well. So the Congressional Medal of Honor was begun in 1861, shortly after the first shots of the Civil War, according to this plaque. It was given for extraordinary valor and sacrifice. It's the highest military decoration presented by the United States government. And 3 Medal of Honor recipients are memorialized here at the City of Lubbock Cemetery, and we'll talk about them when we get to their graves. Well, the wind got so bad at the cemetery that I needed to re-record what I was saying by the gravesite. So our first grave, where Carolyn and I are sitting, was Mr. Joseph F. Knight. He was born in Danville, Illinois on November 23rd, 1863, and actually lived a full life, dying here in Lubbock, May 24th, 1940. He served as a sergeant in Company F of the 6th U.S. Cavalry during the Indian Wars, and specifically the Ghost Dance Indian Wars. And this was December 29th, 1890 through January 15th, 1891. Now, the Ghost Dance Indian Wars came as a result of Native American religious movement. A Native American religious leader had a vision, and he determined through the vision that if they practiced a certain ceremony, that the white man would leave their area. White settlers, whites trying to move in observing this ceremony, thought it was so horrible, thought it was so ghastly, that they named it the Ghost Dance, and that's where we get the Ghost Dance Indian War name. As part of this was the horrible massacre at Wounded Knee with the Lakota Sioux. The cavalry, the 9th Cavalry, was in the process of moving the Lakota into an Indian reservation along the White River, which is a tributary of the Missouri River. One deaf Lakota did not give up his weapon due to the U.S. troops not knowing how to communicate with him. Some accounts say there was a miscommunication as the man was handing over his gun, and someone's gun discharged in the air. One of the U.S. commanders heard this and ordered his troops to open fire. The commanders then called in reinforcements from the cannons that had been placed on an adjacent ridge. These cannons mowed down everyone in range. By the time the smoke had cleared, almost 300 dead Lakota, mostly women and children, 25 dead and 45 injured U.S. troops lay on the ground, most of which was due to friendly fire. The Lakota who had escaped the conflict were then hunted down and murdered by the remaining U.S. troops. And as this was happening, a blizzard came in and prevented the U.S. troops or the Lakota from the nearby reservation from retrieving their dead. So you can see lots of horrible things happening. This was a time where gold had been discovered recently in South Dakota. Whites were moving in. Indians were wanting to protect their territory. Lots of bad blood. Now, as I mentioned, Joseph Knight was not part of the 9th Cavalry, where the Wounded Knee Massacre happened under their auspices, but he was a member of the 6th Cavalry. And so just a few days later, after this blizzard was over, the 6th Cavalry was on patrol, and K Unit came under attack from hostile Indians. Well, Sergeant Knight noticing that K troop was in peril, took part of his column and led an advance to their assistance. And so for courage in the face of the enemy, he was awarded the Medal of Honor on May 1st, 1891. Now, in those days, the Congressional Medal of Honor was evidently much easier to get than it is now. Actually, 20 soldiers received the Medal of Honor at the Wounded Knee Massacre. But I'm thinking from what I've read that definitely Joseph K. Knight did show courage in the face of enemy and was a legitimate Medal of Honor winner. Benjamin and I are here at the gravesite of Herman C. Wallace. Wallace received the Congressional Medal of Honor for heroism in World War II. He was born in Marlow, Oklahoma on June 12, 1925, joined the Army here in Lubbock in June of 1943, served as a private first class in Company B, 301st Engineer Combat Battalion of the 76th Infantry Division. On February 27, 1945, near Prumzerli in western Germany, he and his battalion were on a mine-clearing detail, and he stepped on a well-concealed anti-personnel mine. He heard the characteristic click noise that indicated that the mine was active, and so he knew if he stepped aside, it would explode and kill other members of his squad. He deliberately placed his other foot on the mine when he should have fallen prone. In so doing, he was killed when the charge detonated, giving his own life to save his fellow soldiers from death or injury. And so for most conspicuous gallantry, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor on October 25th, 1945. We salute Herman C. Wallace. Okay, so we're at a marker here for George Andrew Davis Jr. Now, you notice this marker says, in memory of. This is a cenotaph. You know what a cenotaph is, Caroline?
I do. A cenotaph is where that person actually is not really buried. So.
Yeah, it's a memorial to somebody who's buried someplace else. So George Davis joined the Air Force. He's was born in Dublin, Texas, in 1920. He joined the Air Force in 1942. He saw action in World War II in the Pacific Front. Actually downed 7 Japanese planes. And then later, he went to North Korea. He went to the Korean War in 1951 and was involved in that action there. He was involved with in battle against Chinese MiGs and was in an area called MiG Alley. And he saw one of his fellow airplanes was in trouble. He went to the rescue of it against 12 MiGs. He shot down 2 of the 12 MiGs before he himself was hit, and he crashed into a mountain about 30 miles away and died. Now, George Davis is our only flying ace during World War II and the Korean War. He's actually one of only 7 that were flying aces in both World War II and the Korean War. When he died, he was the #1 flying ace for the United States. He wound up being 4th highest flying ace for the Korean War. His medal was given posthumously to his widow at Reese Air Force Base here, and so we honor Lieutenant Colonel, made Major after his death, George Andrew Davis, Jr. To those who served our country in time of war, they gave their today for our tomorrow. Cemetery Supervisor Helen Washington tells me that the Daughters of the American Republic generally bring and place flags at each of the veterans' memorials. That's not happening this year because of the coronavirus. So we pray for a time where we can once again decorate the graves of our troops. So, how did we go from smaller events to a nationwide event? Well, you can really credit General John A. Logan for that. Decatur, Illinois, May 5th, 1868. John Logan was the commander of the Grand Army of the Republic, known as the GAR. He issued a proclamation calling for Decoration Day to be observed annually and nationwide. Now, the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, would be similar today to the Veterans of Foreign Wars. It was one of a number of veterans associations that began following the Civil War. It was established in Decatur just a couple of years before that, in 1866. It would eventually become the largest of several Union veterans organizations that were established after the Civil War. The peak membership was in 1890, around 1890, and it was around 400,000. The GAR would last all the way to 1956 when its final member died. He was 106 years old. His name was Albert Henry Wilson, and he had been a drummer boy in the Union Army. So that ended the GAR. The GAR was the first organized advocacy group in American politics. It promoted voting rights for black veterans. It promoted patriotic education, promoted veterans' pensions, and promoted Republican, especially, political candidates. You see, the Republicans were pretty well held the national light for many, many years. It was not until Grover Cleveland was elected 22nd president that a Democrat was again elected president, was again in the White House. Now, General Logan, in his thinking about starting this Decoration Day, expressed regret, according to his wife after he died, that it was the Southerners rather than the Northerners who launched those beautiful cemeteries, those beautiful ceremonies. He then said it was not too late for the Union men of the nation to follow the example of the people of the South. He says, we've been neglecting our dead while they've honored theirs. And so they set May 30th as the date. A couple of reasons for this. First, it was not the anniversary of any battle on May 30th. And second, it was considered to be an optimum day for flowers to be blooming in the North. In 1868, memorial events were held in 183 cemeteries in 27 states. 1869, it spread to 336 cemeteries, and it grew from there. Now, by 1870, the remains of about 300,000 Union killed had been reinterred in 73 national cemeteries, and they were located near major battlefields. Of course, again, most of those were in the South. In 1871, it was Michigan that made Decoration Day an official state holiday. By 1890, every northern state had followed suit. Meanwhile, what's happening back in the South? Well, in 1868, Southern figures began adding Confederate to their commemorations that were begun in Columbus, Georgia. They claimed that the Northerners had appropriated their holiday. In 1874, Confederate Memorial Day was the first official holiday. after a proclamation by the Georgia legislature. It was been held various days in different states from April 25th all the way to mid-June. Now, this was promoted by, these celebrations were promoted by various associations, mostly women's associations that were founded across the South. The most significant of these was the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They grew from the Civil War, a membership of around 17,000, to by World War I, they had 100,000 members. Their idea was to establish and care for permanent cemeteries for the Confederate dead, to organize commemorative events, and to sponsor appropriate monuments in a permanent way, remembering the dead. And you saw one of those monuments as we visited the City of Lubbock Cemetery. And of course, these monuments are the ones that are in such controversy today. A lot of these established by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The Confederate Memorial Day is still celebrated in most southern states. It's not sure, according to sources, which southern states are official and which are not official. I looked at various things, and there's some discrepancies as to who's official and who's not. In Texas, it's known as Confederate Heroes Day, and it is a state holiday, sort of. State offices still are open, but a skeleton crew only mans them, and so the state employees can take off that day while other employees man it, and then they can take off a different day. It's one of 3 skeleton crew holidays that are in the state of Texas, the other one being Texas Independence Day and San Jacinto Day. The first Decoration Day ceremonies had really no standard program about them. They were typically sponsored in the North by the Women's Relief Corps. This was the auxiliary of the Grand Army of the Republic. And by the 1880s, however, ceremonies were becoming more consistent across geography. The GAR provided handbooks with specified procedures, poems, Bible verses for post commanders to use in planning the local event. By the 20th century, various Union memorial traditions celebrated different days. All of this, they began to merge into one and began to merge into Memorial Day. And Memorial Day was eventually extended beyond Civil War, people who died in the Civil War, to Americans who died in all the wars, especially after the great losses that were suffered during World War I. In the South, the theme of American nationalism was beginning to replace the idea of the Confederacy, that Confederate theme, and only the South. It became more of an American holiday. Parades, speeches, a mixture of religion and celebratory nationalism were occurring. The picture you have on the left is Decoration Day Parade in Chicago, 1912. And on the right is a Decoration Day, 1927. Shows a Civil War veteran saluting with a Boy Scout and a soldier at Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago. In 1913, there was a 50th anniversary, the Blue-Gray Reunion at Gettysburg. It was a 4-day event, featured parades, reenactments, and speeches from host dignitaries, including President Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson was the very first president from the South since before the Civil War. He was born in Virginia. He remembers as a child hearing the news that Abraham Lincoln had been elected president, and his parents were very much Confederate supporters. But he wound up going to college in Princeton, in New Jersey, and pretty well spent the rest of his life either in New Jersey or in Washington. And so, while he was originally from the South, he was also part of Northerner. And so, this Blue-Gray reunion again expanded the idea of Memorial Day and bringing us back together. Now, around that time too, in 1915, poppies became a symbol of Memorial Day. This started with the Battle of Ypres in World War I, which the Americans weren't even involved in. This was the British and the United Kingdom, your Canadians, Indians, etc., against the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. Well, following this horrible battle, Canadian physician John McCrae, who's pictured there on the top left, wrote a poem called In Flanders Field, which you've probably heard. It goes, "In Flanders Field the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row. They mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below." Now in 1918, YWCA worker Moina Michael, pictured on the top right, attended a YWCA Overseas War Secretaries Conference. And she liked the poem, and so she wore a silk poppy pinned to her coat, and she took about 2 dozen with her and distributed those. And from that point on, by 1920, the National American Legion had adopted the poppy as their official symbol of remembrance, and it became a symbol of Memorial Day as well. So what about the official side? How did Memorial Day become an official holiday? Well, more about that in a minute, but let's take another field trip. So we're out at the Lubbock area Veterans War Memorial. War Memorial built to honor those who fought and died during war. And you can see there are sections listing the dead in the Lubbock area from each of the wars: World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and yeah, we're still adding people from Iraqi freedom. As I said, this was built in 2003. It is one of the largest veterans memorials outside of Washington, D.C. What you're seeing now is brick after brick. There are thousands of bricks here honoring different people that fought not just in the war, but may have been in the service during this time. There's a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson about great men.
Great men, not gold, but only men can make a people great and strong. Men who are true and honors seek, steadfast, and suffer long.
Brave men who work while others sleep, who dare while others fly. They build a nation's pillars deep and lift them to the sky. This will remain the land of the free only so long as it is the home of the brave.
Carl Sandburg said, "Valor is a gift. Those having it never know for sure whether they have it till the test comes." Of course, Carl Sandburg is noted most well from having that biography of Abraham Lincoln. The area of construction over here is a new area for Memorial. It's to house 3 monuments. One for the Gold families, which would be those families who have lost relations in the war. Another one for an honor of Congressional Medal of Honor winners, and another third one for those who won the Purple Heart. Was supposed to open this Memorial Day. Because of the pandemic, it'll be a year yet before it opens. So, Benjamin and Caroline are pointing to my dad's brick that's out here. Dad didn't die in the war, but he certainly fought during the war. He was in the Americal Division, and they fought in the South Pacific. He was in the Army. Americal was the only division that did not have a number. It had a name instead. And so they did mop operations in Guadalcanal, in the Philippines, and other places. And Dad was actually in occupied Japan afterwards. He shot the bazooka. He was behind enemy lines at one time, shooting the bazooka, and he was awarded the Bronze Star for that. But what he used to brag about more than anything else was he was a cook, and they liked his cooking. The officers liked his cooking in the war. The official history. Now, the name Memorial Day was first used actually way back in 1882. Again, I mentioned it started as Decoration Day. But they began to use the name Memorial Day and began to drop the idea of Decoration Day, the idea of decorating the graves instead of remembering people. But Memorial Day as a name was not declared the official name by federal law until 1967. And on June 28, 1968, Congress passed the Uniform Monday Holiday Act. It moved 4 holidays to a specified Monday to create a convenient 3-day weekend. And so we moved Memorial Day from May 30th to the last Monday in May. That law took effect in 1971. All 50 states adopted the change within a few years. Of course, there was veteran groups complained about the change, saying that it was actually undermining the very meaning of the day, making it more of a holiday, a time to go out and swim and do all outdoor activities instead of remembering the dead at this time. It was actually not until the year that this went into effect, 1971, that Memorial Day was declared a national holiday by Congress. In 2000, in order to try to bring back something of the real meaning of Memorial Day, Congress passed the National Moment of Remembrance Act. And it asked people to stop and remember the dead at 3 p.m. on that day. So on Memorial Day, the flag is raised briskly to the top of the staff and then slowly lowered to half-staff position. And it's kept that way until noon, and then it is raised up again. The National Memorial Day concert, it takes place on the West Lawn of the U.S. Capitol that day. And across the country, the central event is attending one of the thousands of parades held in both large and small towns. The scholars often make the argument that the United States has a secular civil religion, one with no association to any religious denomination, but the idea which is incorporated in Memorial Day as a sacred event, the Civil War, a new theme of death, sacrifice, and rebirth enters into this civil religion. And so Memorial Day gives a ritual expression to these themes, integrating the community into all this sense of nationalism. And so in that sense does the rest of the Gettysburg Address.
It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Here's a salute to those who have died in our armed forces. If tomorrow all the things were gone I've worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife, I'd thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom, and you can't take that away. And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the man who died, who gave that right to me. And I'll proudly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land, God bless the USA. From the lakes of Minnesota to the hills of Tennessee, across the plains of Texas, from sea to shining sea, from Detroit down to Houston and New York to LA, where there's pride in every American heart, and it's time to stand and say that I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the man who died, who gave that right to me. And I'll proudly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. I know I'm free, and I won't forget the man who died, who gave that right to me, and I'll proudly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the